I was asked today to speak about the Phoenix CeaseFire project, and as I was working away on the presentation, I realized that it might be more beneficial to talk about the conclusions of our project in a larger context, that behind the Chicago and other initiatives that have taken place or replications of it. So I'm deviating a little bit from what we talked about, but I think that it might be more fruitful in terms of broader understanding. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the CeaseFire program, it started up in the late 1990s in Chicago, and the focus of the program was specifically to change behavior and reduce shootings, homicides, and more specifically retaliatory homicides. It involved community mobilization and bringing businesses, NGOs, and residents together on a targeted community, targeted youth to address near-term violence. It brings together outreach workers and violence interrupters, outreach workers which increase or intended to increase or decrease risk factors involving youth who are who might be involved in violence in the near term or immediate future, as well as intervention specialists who are involved in engaging in crisis intervention activities with respect to youth who are going to be immediately involved in violence or near-term violence. And it also involves public education or advocacy programs, it pointing out the consequences of violence in these targeted communities. It involves a faith-based community and an attempt to change the norms of the targeted community, and it also involves criminal justice participation in an attempt to increase the risk of those who are involved in violence, increasing arrest rates, increasing prosecution rates, as well as incarceration. Now, that's sort of the backdrop of this. In Chicago, it was implemented with great success. We saw a 16 to 35% decline in 7 of the 27 communities in which it was implemented in. In 4 of the 6 communities, we saw a reduction in homicide and retaliatory violence. And as a result, we've seen CeaseFire implemented not only across the nation, but it has been picked up across the globe. BJA did a fantastic job of implementing a number of replication sites. Phoenix was one of those. And at the same time, we've seen IADB as well as a number of other development banks that have been funding CeaseFire programs around the globe. In communities that don't have much formal capacity for social control, but we're hoping to increase informal social control through the use of NGOs and implementing the CeaseFire program. Now, before I get to the rest of what I was going to talk about, I do want to point out 2 post-hoc analyses that have been carried out by Papachristos as well as McGuire, who's been trying to take a look at some of these reports. One was Papachristos argues that when you consider Project Safe Neighborhoods and when you consider all the things that went into the kitchen sink or the travel, so to speak, to the way things have been discussed, he argues that once you account for Project Safe Neighborhoods activity, that there's actually been very little impact with respect to the Chicago CeaseFire program. McGuire similarly argues that when you take a broader perspective at a number of the outcomes that were expected or the measures, we don't quite have the findings that some folks have come to believe or so to speak, the miracle change that occurred in Chicago. Now, we had what I call a near replication site in Newark. I call it a near replication site because it incorporated both elements of the Boston CeaseFire program as well as the Chicago CeaseFire program, but there were important differences that took place. One was that they did not use violence interrupters, they did not use case management, and the police played a significantly stronger role in the intervention there. And the folks at Chicago CeaseFire are strongly opposed to considering this a CeaseFire program, but nevertheless it sheds some light on the fact that there was not a significant change in gunshot wounds on the target area compared to the comparison area. In Baltimore, we found something a little bit different. It was implemented with some substantial fidelity in some respects. One issue was that violence interrupters were not used, but rather they used outreach workers to engage in violent interruption work. But we found in Baltimore that there was a significant decline in violence in 4 of the 5 targeted communities. Now, what's interesting was that in 3 of the 5 communities, the program was did not continue. In one of the communities, it's not reported in any of the peer-reviewed articles or any of the formal reports, but popular media suggests or indicates that there was a high degree of police involvement because a gang had infiltrated one of the communities and engaged in high-level narcotics trafficking, posing as the outreach workers in this. So there were some issues with implementation there or fidelity that have not been raised publicly, but are suggestive that there might be some implementation problems. And I point this out because this has been a major concern among law enforcement with the CeaseFire program. In Pittsburgh, I consider the Pittsburgh evaluation one of the stronger evaluations of the CeaseFire model. It was more of a grassroots, data-driven, evidence-based perspective. They brought the folks in from Chicago to provide technical assistance and implemented the Chicago CeaseFire model in Pittsburgh. They did take a little bit of a different perspective there, much like Baltimore, in which they had one group of individuals that served both as the outreach workers as well as the crisis intervention specialists. They implemented a quasi-experimental design. There, they found that it either had no effect or increased homicides, and they also found that it increased aggravated assaults as well as gun assaults in Pittsburgh. So we saw a strong evidence of possibly a boomerang effect. And that brings us to Phoenix. In Phoenix, we had a program that was implemented with some substantial fidelity, although there were some limitations to it. The folks at Chicago CeaseFire played a key role in providing technical assistance to the Phoenix program. We implemented a quasi-experimental design in which we found that there was a decrease of about 16 assaults on average per month, but we saw that there were an increase of about 3 shootings on average per month. There were some problems with fidelity, particularly we do not have the same type of environment in Phoenix as you find in Chicago. We lack the urban density. We lack the same type of density with respect to crime. We did not have a steering committee. It was implemented by Chicanos por la Casa, a non-for-profit, which is heavily Hispanic run. It's the largest Hispanic non-for-profit in the state of Arizona. And so they sort of played the major role of the steering committee, and they had very little contact with the police and criminal justice agencies. And so what I would like to leave you with, if I could, is that one is replication of programs is important. We cannot always, Dr. Weisberg brought up an important point that when we're oftentimes talking about youth, there can be consequences to formal reactions or implementing formal mechanisms of social control and responding to youth. And many folks make the assumption that when non-for-profits or NGOs that are involved in activity, they're obviously well-intentioned, but that does not necessarily mean that we are going to have positive outcomes. And so my message today is, as we all think about implementing evidence-based activities, that we do so in a rigorous manner, because we are not always going to have the positive impacts that we all hope and desire. But in fact, there are the consequences, particularly when we're dealing with gang-related activity, of a boomerang effect. And there is the possibility that our actions are actually going to have a negative impact on criminality and violence, and that we should think about future sites. There are dozens of these sites that are being implemented today with regard to CeaseFire, and perhaps we need to think about alerting folks to make sure that they vigilantly monitor implementation of these programs to ensure that violence increases, or ensure that violence decreases rather than increases. Thank you.